What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. And today's guest is a pioneer in the tech industry. And I'm going to formally introduce Richard Melmon in a second. Richard, I always like to mention other episodes that people should check out. And appropriate for you, because Richard was one of the co-founders of EA, Electronic Arts, and I had the founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, and he talked about on the podcast turning down $50,000 for 33% of Apple from Steve Jobs, and why is interesting story. Tom Kalinske, who is CEO of Sega, who's featured in the book Console Wars, and he talked about Sega versus Nintendo, some fascinating stories there. And I had Alvy Ray Smith, who is co-founder of Pixar, and he had some interesting Steve Jobs stories as well. And I think Richard has some too. Before I get to that, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25, and we help businesses give to and connect to their Dream 100 relationships. We do that by helping you run your podcast. Richard, for me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at a way to give to my relationships, and I found no better way over the past decade to have the people and the companies I admire, their thought leadership, and profile them and share what their knowledge and their lessons are with the world. So if you've thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com. You can email support@rise25media.com. Richard Melmon, just a laundry list. He did the early advertising for Apple. He launched the first spreadsheet, VisiCalc. At Intel, he launched the first digital watch. He co-founded Electronic Arts with Trip Hawkins. In addition to being the co-founder of Electronic Arts, which is a $30 billion market cap, he co-founded Melmon Tawa and Partners, a high-tech advertising agency, which was acquired by Livingston and Co in 1989, and Objective Software, which was acquired by Asymetrix in 1993. He co-founded Bullpen Cap in 2010 with Paul Martino and Duncan Davidson. He's led several of the key investments. Paul Martino also was on the podcast, had some fantastic stories in general and about you specifically, Richard, as well. He also is managing partner at NSV Wolf Capital. Richard, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
We'll get into Paul Martino and how you met him, but I wanted to start off with Apple. And you did the early advertising for Apple. So talk a little bit about that, and if you had interactions with Steve Jobs at that point.
Well, I worked for a company called McKenna. McKenna was a marketing and PR firm, a tiny firm. Regis McKenna was a personal friend of mine. He asked me to join him and help him build out both the PR and advertising side of his business. At that time, one of his clients, one of his tiny clients, was Apple. And I had a long-term relationship with the chairman of Apple, Mike Markkula, who we knew each other well from Intel. And I had met both Steves with Mike before there was anybody else, just the three of them. And I had always been fascinated with the personal computer. I tried to get Intel to do it. I was convinced it was the next thing, because I had launched when I say I mean, as part of a team. I had been involved in the launch of the first digital watch. I was the marketing guy at the Microma division of Intel, and from that experience, the watch experience and the functionality we put into it led me to understand there would be a PC, a personal computer, at some point. But I couldn't get Intel to do it. They hated the watch business, and they hated me telling them to go even further into this consumer thing. So to
give people a sense, Richard, we're talking like you're at Intel in like 1974, right? So
my Chrome experience was really 75, 76, 77-ish. And
I just want to give people a sense, because you're talking about the computer in 1974. That is not normal then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
So,
I was
yeah.
I was one of probably 5 or 6 people, Gates, guys like me, Bill Gates, had this kind of crazy vision. And of course, the two Steves actually did it. They built something. I actually was in a little company that I won't probably even remember the name of. I left Intel to join a little company, and we actually competed a little bit in a kind of a funny way with the early Apple stuff. But anyway, I went to McKenna, and so I was dealing with Steve Jobs all the time. He was as a young man, he was brutal. Let's be clear, I think he turned out to be a genius, a very fascinating person. I could go on at length about him in his older age. I didn't know him once he became rich and famous, I had no real contact with him. But in the early days, he was in my life all the time. One of his girlfriends worked for me and at McKenna, and so we saw Steve all the time, and he was difficult. He didn't give any real indication when he was young that he was going to turn out to be this genius that he became. He was obnoxious. He wasn't really that great at doing what he did, but in the end, he grew up and became what the world now knows. And I loved what he did, and I'm terribly sad that he didn't, that he's not an older man now doing what he could do.
What did you see, Richard, at that time? We're talking like in the mid 70s, and you're seeing a computer. Like, most people are not even thinking in that realm. And I know your background is in physics. And so I'm not sure how did you land in marketing from being in physics?
Well, I wasn't a good enough physicist to really be a physicist. And so I had to confront that reality. My brain didn't work the way it really needs to work to be to be at the forefront of physics. I did it for 10 years. I kind of operated kind of in the margins between physics and kind of crude early engineering phases. I was always involved from even when I was a physicist. I was in an entrepreneurial company in 1962, a venture-backed company in 1962. Wow. I lived in San Francisco. I lived in Philo Farnsworth's grandmother's house. Philo Farnsworth, the inventor of television, for crying out loud. I had uncles who knew both Hewlett and Packard. I was destined to be an entrepreneur. And so even when I was a physicist, I did it in a very kind of weird and wonderful way. I was always kind of more creative than I was technically astute.
Was any of your family entrepreneurs growing up?
I had two uncles who wanted to be entrepreneurs, and wanted to be involved in the sciences, and they influenced me enormously. My father was an optometrist and was also, technically astute. So I came from that kind of a family. I always knew I was going to be a physicist. I went to Berkeley, and it was all kind of hardwired in. I built ham radios and flew model airplanes as a kid, and so it was just natural.
You left Intel because you're like, there's this computer thing that's going to be big. What did you do next then?
There was a little spin-off out of Intel. It started a company called Umtech. It was started by a guy named Albert Yu, and we built something that fell into the crease between the game business and the computer business, and it ultimately didn't work, and we left the business. But in that period, I negotiated with Bill Gates for a basic language compiler that would run on what was called an F8, which is a little controller chip that Fairchild built. I mean, it was wonderful times, and Bill must have been like, I don't know, he was probably 20 years old when I met him. And I got to know Bill a little bit later with the spreadsheet, with the VisiCalc stuff.
What was he like then at age 20?
Oh, him, you knew. I mean, this kid you knew was going to be something. Now, he turned out, I mean, even more magnificent than I ever imagined he would, given what he's done with his money and everything. But you knew that he was going to be something. He was just very special, and very smart, of course, and extremely determined. I mean, this young man was really a very determined guy. So that was clear.
You mentioned VisiCalc, right? So tell people about that.
This is an interesting thing. I was working, again, I was at McKenna. I was doing struggling to get Apple into the business world. We couldn't figure out how to make Apple other than just a hobby machine. We wanted businesses to use it. We wanted businesses to buy it, but none of us. Markula struggled with it. I did. We all struggled with how do we get this thing to be useful for business. It was critical. It's when first time I met Trip Hawkins, who ultimately I founded EA with. He was at Apple then trying to figure out the same thing. A friend of mine, a guy named Ben Rosen, became a famous venture capitalist. Very interesting guy. Wasn't then. He was a journalist, actually, an analyst and a journalist. Showed me this prototype of what was called the spread. They didn't even know what to call it. It was called VisiCalc. Visual calculator was their idea, but it turned out to be the spreadsheet. And there was a big battle over what to name it that I was involved in. But anyway, I looked at that, and in 2 seconds, literally 2 seconds, I knew the whole future of personal computing was going to be opened up and changed. In fact, the whole world would change. It was at that point I realized that everything that we're now living with was going to happen. It literally 2 seconds. I told Ben, this is a pisser. I said to him, I hope you can put that on the air. And it just was clear to me this was going to allow the personal computer to be used usefully in business, and it was going to really make Apple. And so it's a very complicated story about how I finally ended up working for the VisiCalc people. But literally the first day on the job that I was at the what became VisiCorp name, I actually insisted we rename the company after the spreadsheet. It was called Personal Software. But literally the first day I'm at the company, I got a call from Steve Jobs. Steve never calls me. He was much too much of a glorious, arrogant big shot to call a guy like me, a minion like me. And so I knew something probably not pleasant was in the cards. And sure enough, he came over to see me, and he threatened to put us out of business. Here was this little teeny company building a product that was absolutely making his company a success. And he was coming over to say, hey, we've cloned VisiCalc, and we're going to put it in, we're going to offer it for free to everybody. But we, in the graciousness of our heart, we're going to give you the chance. We'll give you $1 a copy if you license it to us. And he had his bare sandaled feet up on my desk as he was telling me this. And I remember this clearly. I said, Steve, I'm going to say a couple of things to you. First, take your feet off my desk. And second, get the blank, and I used a very bad word, get the blankety blank out of my office, because you guys aren't smart enough to clone VisiCalc, and you're just bluffing me. So get it the hell out of here. And he did. And I was right. They were bluffing. And so it's unappreciated, but the first spreadsheet had to work in a very tiny memory space within the Apple II computer. And it was an incredibly magnificent job of coding that allowed it to be done. And there was no way Apple was going to do this. In fact, there were 20 or 30 or 40 called VisiClones that attempted to compete with VisiCalc, but never did. And so it wasn't until much later when the IBM machine came out, and the history of this spreadsheet of VisiCalc, very dysfunctional company, very complicated, interesting story. And so the company ultimately failed, but there was a period of a few years where, boy, we were the kings of everything.
Do you think, Richard, if Steve Jobs came to you in a different manner, that you would have considered that offer? Like not a threatening manner, but offering, listen, we'll give you $1, whatever. Do you think that would be under consideration or not at all?
Well, I think there would have been, there was a very good reason for Apple to try to do something with this company because it was so central to them. And there was also a very good reason for this little company to do something with Apple in order to, bolster its own self. But, we were all crazy. Steve was crazy. I was crazy. Yeah, we were all.
What do you say? Why do you say you were crazy?
We were all infected with the glorious mission of building out this destiny of the digital world. It was in us, and we could feel it palpably, and we all felt we were warriors, like going to war almost. But we all felt just invincible, and so it was very difficult in those days from a human point of view. Young people, building a whole new world to kind of act reasonably, and so there was a lot of unreasonable and crazy kind of thing, like Steve coming over in that way. I mean, that's nuts. Why would a person do that? But we were all kind of infected with that kind of hubris. And so,
I remember, Richard, in talking to Alvy Ray Smith, and he also kept mentioning Moore's law, and also I think his background is in physics. And I don't know, so I'm curious of what you saw the application of Moore's law becoming. He, kind of plotted out Toy Story based on Moore's law, and it was amazing to hear him talk about. He's like, based on computing power and Moore's law, it's going to take 5 more years. Like, he just knew the time period it would take. And what did you see was going to be happening?
Well, listen, people could talk about Moore's law, but I argued about Moore's law with Gordon Moore in the hallways of Intel. I said, Gordon, you're not being aggressive enough in thinking about how big this memory business is going to be. Yeah. It's going to be much.
And you're at Intel. Yeah.
I'm at Intel with Gordon, who was the inventor of Moore's law. I mean, he was an amazing. And so,
we'll give people a brief like Moore's law for people who don't know what it is. How would you describe it?
It's just that the ability of the technical people to continually improve the performance of the integrated circuit was, it wasn't computable. You couldn't compute why this thing called Moore's law worked. It just was, experience showed that the performance of these products kept getting better and better and better as the collective technology that built them and the designs of them got better and better and better. And so the power kept increasing in a predictable way every, you could say every 18 months, every 12, it depended on how you wanted to compute it. But we could predict quite reliably what the power would be at some future point. We're kind of running into the more or less the end of that now. There's still these improvements, but the costs of making the improvements are now so atrociously huge that the Moore's law is kind of, in some sense, somewhat coming to an end. That's not strictly true, but from a practical point of view, more or less true. But back in when I was a young man, we could say, hey, when Rich is 75, here's the power that these machines are going to have, and be pretty close to right.
So at that point, you see the computing power just going up exponentially, and so you saw at that point the vision for the computer just to be mainstream based on
the thing that was a little weird about guys like me was I just knew. I knew to a certainty that this had to happen, and that there would be this absorption into the culture of this computing ability. I don't know why I knew that. I don't know how I knew it. It wasn't a rational, thoughtful process. It was an intuition, but I was convinced to a certainty, and it turned out I was right. I mean, go figure. I mean. I'm not prescient about things today. I can't tell you what's going to happen next week. let alone 5 years from now. But back then I could, and there were a bunch of us that kind of were in it and knew that this was going to happen, and it did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, looking at your background, hindsight's 2020, but like you had this background in physics, you had an MBA in business, from Stanford. So it kind of this cross section of what is this going to look like, and also what's the application in the world. And then, so talk about the beginning of EA Sport or Electronic Arts. I always hear like John Madden's voice, like,
yeah,
but Electronic Arts.
I hate to be candid and honest about this because I love bragging about Electronic Arts. It gives me great pleasure. I've had selfies taken with Saudi princes who wanted to show their kids that they had talked to a founder of Electronic Arts. People come up to me all the time and say, my kids, blah, blah, blah. I had very little to do with Electronic Arts, the truth be told. I had one important thing that I contributed, which was understanding that we had to take charge of our own marketing and distribution, and we had to become a marketing powerhouse to ultimately dominate the business. But I didn't fight with, but I didn't get along with Trip Hawkins. And it was in everybody's interest that one or the other of us leave the company fairly early. And so I was gone after about 2 years. And so I can't really honestly brag too much about the company. But when Trip and I wrote the business plan, the business plan almost to the letter turned out to be correct, with the one exception that we had to really, the EA about 8 years in, they had to reverse engineer the Sega machine and get into the game platform business, which they did. And that's when ultimately they could go public. But the basic vision of the company to have a studio and all that stuff, Trip and I collectively put that together. And I feel quite proud that we got that right. And even though the two of us really couldn't get along all that well in the end, still, the combination of the two of us, I think, was critical to making the company ultimately a big success. But I don't want to over pat myself on the back. I just, I enjoy the story of it. I wasn't really that much of a game guy myself, although my son is incredibly much a game fellow.
Was that a hard decision at the time, Richard?
What was
to leave? I mean, like you said, as one of us, and
they basically threw me out. That made it easier. It was kind of ugly. It was hurtful.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I could have handled it better. Everybody could have handled it better, but they were fair. I mean, I kept a bunch of stock and so forth. So it wasn't as if I was screwed or anything. It just was. It was kind of it was unnecessary. If we had been a little more sane, if everybody had been a little bit less imbued with this kind of craziness that made this industry, it probably didn't have to happen, but it did.
What was next then? So you leave.
That's when I started my high-tech ad agency, and basically, I launched the Xilinx and some of the precursor to Cisco, and I mean, I basically did a lot of the advertising for companies. I didn't do Intel, but I did Sun Microsystems and so forth. So 30 or 40 of the main high-tech companies were my clients in advertising. We did a nice job, and we then sold it to a pretty interesting ad agency up in Seattle that wanted to get into the high tech business. And so I then went on and did this. I had in my mind all along building a better spreadsheet, and I did that in Objective Software.
Talk about the lessons for several of your companies have been acquired. Are there any, what are some of the mistakes or lessons you learn, like other people now, like, one day I'm going to sell my company? What were some of the battle scars?
I think there's only one thing that I've learned. I was with this little company after Intel that built a product that I knew the product wasn't quite right, but I thought I had such expertise in marketing and computer sales from the digital wash experience. I thought, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm such a good marketeer. I can make this successful, and then we'll fix it. Bad mistake. The worst mistake of my long career now was that thing. You have to have the product right. Companies don't fail because marketing isn't done right. Companies don't fail because you can't find the right sales guys. Companies don't fail because the advertising message isn't perfect. companies fail because the product doesn't really suit the market and doesn't work right. And so that's the only wisdom I think I've come up with over now that I've been doing this for 50 years.
That's a good point. So there has to be a product market fit for it to work. Fit.
That's right.
And so I'd love to hear so some of these instantaneous, like you saw the spreadsheet, you're like, this is it. This is what's going to do. And obviously you help, you invest in companies,
Yes.
with the company. So I love to hear one where you knew instantaneously, another one, maybe you thought you knew instantaneously, but it was, I don't know what the batting average is for a good, but it's probably like a Hall of Fame baseball player. You bat, 300-400, you're a Hall of Famer. So
probably not that good. It's probably not that good. I'm famous at Bullpen for saying, guys, this has to happen. This is such a great idea. This obviously has to happen. And we see that a lot. Now, the problem with that is just because something has to happen doesn't mean the particular instantiation of how it will happen is the thing that's making me say that. So when I look at stuff that comes in and think it has to happen, there's a lot of times when, yes, ultimately what has to happen happens, but it doesn't happen with the group that I put my money into. And so it's not that easy.
There's timing involved. Like you're thinking the computer in 1975. So
there's so much involved. It's timing, it's luck, it's not a knowable. In the end, it's not a knowable process. That's why a venture firm makes investments in 25 companies, and 2 of them will return the fund, but you don't know which 2. And now that I've been doing formal venture stuff for a long time, I realize not even I can figure out exactly which one of these damn things is going to make us the money. It's humbling, but it's a process that is not knowable in a fine-tooth way. Once a company has absorbed maybe 10 or 15 or $20 million of early money and has been around for 3 or 4 or 5 years and has been engaged in the marketplace and is making revenues, then you can start analyzing it like, the hedge funds analyze their deals. Then you can start looking at the numbers, and the numbers will actually give you a pretty good indication of what's going to happen. But in the early days, the classic numbers of growth and revenue and all that are usually, they can be a little bit helpful, but nowhere near as much helpful as people imagine. And so analytics isn't much help in the very earliest period of company formation.
I know, Richard, Paul was saying, you were just at his office all the time, so you just decided to give him a key. You're like, you're here all the time, might as well give you a key. What strikes you about Paul? Because you have a lot of different opportunities, I imagine, and you probably choose them carefully. So why Paul and Duncan with Bullpen Cap?
I know Duncan for many years, and I knew him well. And he's a very smart guy. And I had met Paul probably before we did Bullpen. I probably met him 5 years prior, and had invested, was the first check in his company, Aggregate Knowledge. Paul is just one of these guys. It takes maybe 10 seconds or 20 seconds to realize this guy's smarter than you. In fact, he's the smartest guy in the room. Paul's, he's got a mind. He's a genius. He was born with a freaky, wonderful brain, and he's a character. And I loved him from the first go. I mean, he's half my age. He's younger than my children. But I just immediately liked him. And yeah, he hung out in our little office on Sand Hill Road, which was then mostly a consulting firm. We weren't really an investment company yet. And we got to know each other over the years. And when Duncan and he came to me, the last thing on my mind was becoming an actual real venture capitalist. But I did, and I think I fooled them. I don't think they realized how old I was when they hired. When they said, "Hey, let's put this bullpen together," because Duncan's not that young. He's not anywhere near as old as I am, but not that young. Paul was the young guy, and then there was Duncan, and then it was really quite old me. But I don't think they knew how old I was because I looked young. And so in the end, we had to bring in some younger people to make a venture firm. You can't have a venture firm in which the old guy, which everybody has to retire. The investors want to have a long-term generational stability. And so, but it was great fun. And I still do, I'm now emeritus with them, and I do they let me do a deal or two here and there, and I enjoy it enormously and go to all the partner meetings. But in the early days, we were really working at it. It was fascinating. And all of us learned, we had to learn how to really do it as we went. And it of course, has worked out very, very well.
Do you remember any advice that you gave either Duncan or Paul that struck them, or some observations? Because you've been in the industry for, since the beginning of the computers.
People don't listen to advice and so forth. I mean, we went back and forth, and I think we all respected each other, but I've never been the type to be reverently thought of as some kind of guru. And so I think I was able to make them understand that the analytics, they're very analytical. Both those guys are very analytical. And and you think a physicist would be analytical too. And I always tell people, listen, I'm a physicist. I can analytic anybody generally, except another physicist. But there's more to it than that. And I think they ended up seeing that I was successful with them in picking deals. They ended up, I think, in the end, learning from that more than me convincing them with any argument.
What's an example of that where you saw a deal that, based on what you've seen in the past, that met your criteria?
Well, there's a company that was controversial that I wanted to invest in that was controversial. And they finally kind of grudgingly went along with it, and it's going to turn out to make probably more money than any other investment in the history of Bullpen. And so I think that experience was important to both Duncan and Paul.
What did you see there? What was it that you saw that maybe other people didn't?
It was a somewhat on a tiny scale. It was kind of a spreadsheet-like experience. So this is a company that's now called Braze. It was called Appboy in the beginning, but it was a company that we invested in very small amount of money as a seed investment. It probably wasn't more than a couple $100,000, and it was in a funny space. It wasn't clear what was going on. And then the founder of the company came and had lunch with me one day, and he said, "Rich, we're going to change the direction of the company and try to become the CRM for mobile." And as soon as he said that, everything snapped, and I knew, oh my God, this is right, and this is needed, and this is going to be a huge winner. And I went back and I tried to convince the partners to let me do a preemptive investment in this company that would have given us a very, very big position. And I wasn't able to convince them to do it. And we ended up putting pretty good money into it, but not as much as I would have wished. And so I never let them forget that. I keep every day, it's 10 years now, and I keep bringing that up every chance I can. And of course, it annoys the hell out of everybody. And I shouldn't do it. It's ridiculous. But we're still going to make a huge return on this company. But it was just like, okay, this was one of those things when I got it right, and it happens every now and then. But it's rare. It doesn't happen that often. I was much smarter about everything back when I was young, and in arguing with Gordon Moore about Moore's law. In this world, I'm just another guy trying to figure it out like everybody else.
Talk about NSV Wolf Capital and what you're doing there.
My partner there, who I've known forever, a guy named Hiroshi Menjo, is a Japanese. Japanese came to America 30 years ago, became an American citizen, but he's fundamentally Japanese. And so he and I made a living giving advice to major enterprises in Japan about the coming digital age. And we did that starting in 1996 in another partnership with McKenna, interestingly enough. But ultimately did it in our own company starting in 2002. And we were consultants fundamentally. But little by little, we realized that the only way to get companies to really do something important is to get them to put money in. And so we created a fund of funds in which we would invest in Silicon Valley VCs and use that to inform the limited partners that we had gotten out of Japan. And so that NSV Wolf Capital is a small fund of funds, also does direct investing, that gets its money from 5 big Japanese companies who want to do the right thing in terms of moving better into the digital age. It's been fantastically successful. Our LPs love the advice we're getting. We're actually going to make them a little bit of money as well. And so it's just been good all around.
How do you see the differences between Japan and the US as you're working with the US based companies and the Japanese based companies?
Well, you have to be kind of careful because it's not a one size fits all explanation. But generally, Japan is the large Japanese companies tend to be fairly rigidly run, very hierarchical. The very top managements tend to be a bit out of touch with the fast moving developments. And middle management tends to have a difficulty, even if they can follow them, really getting initiatives through because everybody is so cautious. Now that's changing. And there are entrepreneurs in Japan that are fantastic. And there are companies, there's been a whole generation now of decent entrepreneurship. The venture industry in Japan's a little bit difficult and hasn't been that vibrant, but that's changing too. And so I think the cliches that we have about Japan and Japanese culture and companies, there's some truth to it, but you have to be careful and not look at those cliches only. You have to look past them. And we've had some fantastic experiences now in really getting companies in Japan that were hidebound to really loosen up, and they're doing extremely well. So it's an exciting thing to go through.
Richard, I'm curious from your perspective, what's on the horizon? And we were talking about before we hit record that you're skeptical of AI.
Well, look at the work that DeepMind has done in particular, now part of Google, but the work of those guys has been incredible. And so there's no question that these AI methods in certain instances can be enormously helpful in finding relationships in the data that are subtle and not obvious. I don't think that AI is going to solve huge cultural issues, or I don't think this very famous book *Sapiens*, written by Yuval Harari. He goes on at great length about how there's going to be a melding of the machine and the man and so forth. I think he's crazy. I don't think that's right. He's a genius. The book is fantastic. And I, how can I say anything negative about the book? But that one idea where there's going to be this inevitable melding of man and machine and singularities and the machines are going to take over completely misunderstands the evolutionary roots of life and humanity and so forth. And so I think that part of it's very much overdone. I think the algorithmic social networking stuff we're going through now is going to have to be fixed in some way. We can't allow this Facebook nonsense to continue the way it has been. It's just, that's a pernicious evil that has to be somehow gotten rid of. I don't know how we do it. I'm glad it's not my job to figure out how to do it, but we can't let that continue. So I think AI has to be taken with a very, very large grain of salt, all the while giving it its due in in a practical way, solving some really interesting problems. This protein folding business that's been announced by DeepMind is fascinating. Again, it's not a panacea. If you talk to the scientists in the field, they say, hey, it's really interesting and it's very, very helpful, but it doesn't get everything right. And you still need to go in by hand and figure out how to tweak each of these things, doing the quantum mechanical computations right down at the atomic level if you're going to do true drug discovery. So, what
do you think will be best use cases? Yeah, what do you think will be best use cases for AI?
Well, anytime there's massive data in which there are patterns to be discovered that can be usefully exploited. So diagnosis is going to be helpful and so forth. For sure, the techniques we've developed for that are going to continue to be impressive and important. And everything is going to have a little AI in it. It's going to be one of these generic things where you're going to have all the applications will have to do a better job of understanding what the data says.
Richard, as far as with this business and throughout your career, there's always tough decisions to be made. Who do you turn for advice, like colleagues, when you're thinking something through, or you want another set of eyes on it? Who do you turn to?
Well, the first thing I do is I ask myself, hey, what would Don Valentine do? Don was the founder of Sequoia Capital, and Sequoia is the only venture firm in the world that I think actually really knows what it's doing, at least did in the Don Valentine era. So I first asked myself that. He passed away a few years ago, and he was the guy that really put Tripp and I together to found Electronic Arts, and so I have a deep admiration for him. And but I take the counsel of my partners, all of them. Both on the NSV Wolf Capital side and on the Bullpen side. I listen to them. I ask them for their input. I listen to my wife very carefully. I have a son whose advice I seek from time to time. And then there's some there's just some old friends of mine that I occasionally will pick the brain of. As you get older, you do realize you don't really know what you're doing, and you to avoid making disastrous mistakes, you really do need to listen to the people around you.
What does your son do now? You mentioned he's more in gaming.
He's right at he's done a lot of things, but right at the moment he's trying to build a I can't call it really a game. What would I call it? Anyway, he has a fascinating take on some aspects of psychology that he's gotten very interested in, and he's trying to figure out how to put this together in what would be really a different kind of social networking paradigm. And so it's one of the more, he's prolific in terms of coming up with ideas, and he and I have done a bunch of things that were right but didn't quite make it. So I'm going to be curious to see how this one turns out for him.
What's his background? Is he a programmer, or?
He made himself into a programmer. He actually had a degree in economics, and he got a law degree, but he ended up in this business, and he trained himself to be a pretty successful and competent programmer.
Was that through osmosis, like around the dinner table, hearing your stories? Because it seems like he kind of went a different route in the beginning, going into law.
My son and I have a relationship like many fathers and sons, where I think I think there was some osmosis, but he's his own person, and he's a hell of a lot smarter in many ways than I am, and so I think that I have no idea how he ended up.
I find this fascinating because, like, as a parent myself, I mean, I have younger kids, like 7 and 10. What you discussed around the dinner table, how that affected him. I mean, ultimately they're going to take their own path, but they're still affected probably by your advice, your lessons, just parenting in general?
It's by example. I mean, it's really by example. He worked at EA as a tester there. Even after they kicked me out, he continued to work there, and he knows, he's close to some of the old EA people, even as I am. But so he was always, when I was consulting and we did stuff we put companies together, we would just do things. So it's really, I think you're right. It's not literally around the dinner table, but it's certainly around the house and around the life. And just because they know your friends and they know what you're doing, it can't help but rub off.
What was an example of something you said you've worked on some projects together?
We actually created the first internet radio venture that was really right. And it was called Binary Broadcasting of America. And it failed. We couldn't raise money for it, but we anticipated all of the Pandora and all of that stuff. And it was largely his work. And we had a woman who really knew the radio business that was enormously helpful, who's an artist by all, go figure, but she had started her life selling radio ad space. And so between the two of them and so forth, we put this thing together that should have become Pandora, but didn't. That happens a lot.
I love it. Richard, first of all, I want to be the first one to thank you.
Sure.
Everyone should check out nsvwolfcapital.com. They should check out bullpencap.com. Where else should people check you out online?
Well, just Google me and you'll see. I have a long and storied Google track. And I used to be confused with a famous Chicago restaurateur, and I would get comped when I went into fancy restaurants because people confused me with him. And now I hope he can be confused with me, although I doubt that he is.
First one to thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like $100 grand.